Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're looking at the politics of parliamentary reform. At least in theory, Parliament is the central institution of UK democracy. Yet often it appears subordinate to government. Why does this matter? How did it come about? And are there lessons for the possibility of reform in the future? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Parliament is the core political institution in many democracies. It's the body that voters elect. It's from Parliament that government, the executive branch, is formed. And Parliament provides the forum in which issues are debated, proposals are scrutinised, and key decisions are made. So who decides what Parliament discusses and how time is allocated is crucial. Here in the UK, that power is overwhelmingly concentrated in the hands of the government, meaning that most MPs have little say over what they debate. But that seems curious. Parliament, it's often said, is sovereign, yet Parliament allows a supposedly subordinate body, the government, to decide what it does. So what's going on? How has this situation come about? And what can we learn from it? Well, my colleague, Dr. Tom Fleming, has just co-authored an article exploring exactly these questions. He is lecturer in British and Comparative Politics here in the UCL Department of Political Science and a member of the UCL Constitution Unit. And he's also an expert on all things parliamentary, and I'm delighted that he joins me now. So Tom, welcome back to UCL Uncovering Politics. Very good as ever to have you on the show. And let's begin with a bit of background here. Both of us are very familiar, I guess, with these parliamentary things, but many of our listeners won't be. So when we're talking about Parliament's agenda, what do we actually mean by that? And how is that agenda decided today?
Okay, thanks, Alan, and thanks very much for having me back. I suppose the very first thing I should say is that we're talking here about only one bit of Parliament. In the Parliament in the UK has two chambers, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And what we're focused on here and what we focused on in this article is the House of Commons in particular. Things work differently out the other end of the corridor. So in the House of Commons, as you've already said, in a way, most of what is discussed in the House of Commons is decided by the government. So when we talk about agenda control or agenda setting, we're mostly talking about who decides what things, what motions, what bills, what proposals are going to be debated and discussed on any given day. And so in the House of Commons, the default situation is that the government decides what's discussed. There is a rule that's called Standing Order 14, and it literally begins, save as provided in this order, government business shall have precedence at every sitting. And then it goes on to list some exceptions to that default arrangement. Those exceptions are things that I think some listeners might be familiar with. So there are things called opposition days. There are 20 of those in each session, a session usually lasting about a year, though not always. There are 20 of those. There are then 35 days, though not all of those are actually in the House of Commons itself, where the agenda
is 35 days every year.
5 days every year or every session, which are set by a committee of backbench MPs. So those who are not ministers and are not sort of spokespeople for the opposition parties, but backbench MPs. There are days when they can choose what's discussed. And then there are a certain number of Fridays in each session set aside when laws proposed by backbenchers, so-called private members' bills, can then be discussed. And I suppose the latter of those has been in the news quite a lot recently because of the so-called assisted dying bill.
So just listening to you there, actually, and setting out the various exceptions to this rule, kind of sounds like there are quite a lot of days when non-government business is discussed. I mean, I don't know how many days a year Parliament sits, but, maybe 200 days, something like that. And if there are 35 opposition days and then...
There's 20 opposition days, there's 35 backbench days, although I think only about 27 possibly of those have to be in the chamber. Some of them happen elsewhere. But yeah, to engage with the basic point, yes, there are still days when... There are quite a large number of days, really, when other actors can set the agenda. But I think there's various things we need to bear in mind when interpreting what that means. The first of which is perhaps to say that even when the government chooses what's discussed, that's not the same as saying only they discuss it. And actually, particularly when we think about Parliament's role being to scrutinise the government and to scrutinise the government's laws, the fact there's more time spent on government business could actually mean we're getting more scrutiny, more chances for those other MPs to scrutinise them. So it's as simple as saying sort of more time for the government is worse for the opposition in terms of some of their goals, but in terms of deciding what's discussed, it clearly means there's less time for that.
But I guess I was going in kind of the opposite direction.
Exactly.
Isn't that actually the case that the opposition and others can put all sorts of things on the agenda and get lots of things through?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you suggesting that actually the government does have more control than that suggests?
I think there's two things that would slightly push against that. One is that there are limits on the types of things that they can propose on these days. So legislation, I talked there about private members' bills. Those are bills that, subject to overcoming certain procedural hurdles, have some chance of getting to be the law. But on those opposition days and on those backbench days, they're mostly they're not debating laws. They're debating motions. So they might simply be neutral motions that say, the House has considered X or Y issue. More often, particularly for the opposition, there'll be a motion that expresses some sort of criticism of the government, but their passage mostly has no immediate substantive impact. So these are chances to debate an issue, express a view, but they're not a chance to push through policies or change things, or at least to invite MPs to vote for policies.
So would it be fair to say kind of when Parliament is not, when its business is not being directed by government, then Parliament is more just the unkind phrase might be a talking shop. Whereas when Parliament is actually doing serious stuff and making decisions that might impact people's lives, that's very much being controlled by government. Or is that going too far?
I think that's perhaps slightly phrasing it in an overblown way, but broadly, yes. Parliament, when the Commons, when its agenda is being set by the others, is largely in a debating mode, and when it's set by the government, it's largely in a sort of legislating, decision-making mode. And then just the second thing I might just briefly note is that also the timing and distribution of some of these days is not entirely within the opposition or the backbench business committee's grasp. And so whilst the rules say the opposition should get 20 of these days in each session, it doesn't say when they should happen. It doesn't say the opposition should get to pick when they happen. So the opposition are reliant on the government making that time available, which by and large they usually are. But at certain times, it does mean the government can hold these back or avoid them being on a certain sort of awkward day and things like that. And because they are set out in a kind of pro-rata, well, not in a pro-rata fashion, they're set out per session. And I've said earlier that a session usually lasts about a year. But once a session goes longer than a year, that then means the sort of the share of days going to these, or the guaranteed share of days going to these other actors, could get smaller if the government doesn't voluntarily make extra days available.
So it sounds like the government agenda control over Parliament, over the House of Commons in the UK really matters. I mean, this is something that really makes a difference to what kinds of things can go through, what kinds of things can pass.
Absolutely. And if we step back a bit, I think one of the ways that I've found it useful that others have used to try and sort of explain the importance of agenda setting rules for what happens in the House of Commons is we often study electoral systems. Obviously, you've done research on electoral systems to try and think about how the votes we cast at elections then get translated into seats in a particular chamber of Parliament. And the sort of the next step of how those seats then get translated into the politics that comes out the other end, particularly policy outcomes. At that point, the electoral system stops mattering, and what matters really is, among other things, the procedures by which that Parliament or that Chamber of Parliament chooses to then share out influence amongst the different actors.
So the procedural geekery really matters.
Indeed.
Absolutely. Good. And how does the UK compare with other countries? Is this unusual or is the UK typical?
The UK is not typical. It's usually seen in the literature as being at the more government-controlled end of the possible spectrum of kind of agenda-setting processes. So it's not true that all other parliaments do it one way and the UK is the weird one. But it is true that when you think about sort of degrees of government control, the agenda in the House of Commons is set by the government to a much greater extent than it is in many other places, where there tends to be a larger degree of input from other parties through a variety of means. So sometimes there might be a sort of a business committee of some kind where the party leaders or party business managers get together to agree the agenda, possibly by consensus or possibly through some kind of rules that allocate influence proportionately to your seats, but through a variety of ways, including in some places, the chamber itself ending up having a vote on the proposed agenda. Different parliaments manage to spread out influence over the agenda in a slightly more diffuse way.
And we're going to be focusing on how this system actually came about. So perhaps we should get the kind of overall picture of that. So how this has changed over time, when this current system emerged, before we go into some of the detail on that.
Absolutely. So the particular episode that we're going to be talking about was in 1902, which was something called the Balfour Reforms. I'll come back to that in a second, but I think the main story here is that around the start of the 19th century, there was far less government control, far fewer rules about when MPs could and couldn't propose things, far fewer restrictions on their ability to do so. And gradually, across the course of the 19th century, through a series of reforms over time, that government control got extended. So sometimes in bigger steps, sometimes in smaller steps, but it's sort of a long-term process of that accretion of government control. And then in 1902, the episode that we studied, you have this moment called the Balfour Reforms, so called because they were led by the senior minister and soon after Prime Minister, Arthur Balfour, which cemented that process. It sometimes gets talked about as a sort of big bang, but I think it's better to see it as really the culmination of this longer-term process. And that basically set the template that has sort of remained since, with some slight adjustments. So that's the first time they adopt a rule that basically has a very similar formulation of saying the default is the government chooses, apart from some exceptions. And that has changed slightly. So backbench business was only introduced in 2010, although that was quite similar to something that had sort of persisted in the 20th century for a while as well. But the basic model of government control as the default was sort of probably cemented at the start of the 20th century, but had evolved gradually across the 19th.
And you're focusing in on this particular episode in 1902. What's so interesting about that moment?
So I think a number of things. Partly that this has been singled out by historians, political scientists and so on as being the sort of landmark moment that capped off this process. So that's one reason. Another reason is exactly, as I sort of just said, that principle, the basic idea that the default arrangement is that time belongs to the government, except some exceptions. That seems to us quite an important procedural moment as well, sort of saying that in black and white in the rules.
So do I understand by that it had already become the case before 1902 that government tended to dominate the agenda of Parliament, but it was always possible for Parliament to kind of reverse that without government say, or the government had to continually kind of reassert that power, whereas now it is the case that basically government would have to consent to removing this power.
I think that's right. It's a bit of both in that over time, certain days or certain slots had been sort of earmarked as those either explicitly for the government or for types of business that tended to be things the government would do. So the same in effect. But what would tended to happen, particularly from the 1880s onwards, so for about the 2 decades running up to this change, was that towards the end of a session, the government would find it was running out of time for other business it wanted to get through before Parliament would stop sitting. And so what it would do, it would introduce a motion saying, OK, for the rest of this session, we're going to have that slot and that slot that's normally for other MPs is now going to be the government business. So they would take up more than their sort of default allocation. And what happened in this change is that they basically built in that process of extension. So they slightly enlarged the share of days given to the government. They made it more predictable which times would be given to the government, and they built into the rules that automatically later in the session more time would accrue to the government rather than the government having to come to MPs and say, could we have more time, please? And I think that speaks to a really important distinction here. We sometimes use the term government to mean the ministers sitting in their offices in Whitehall, who were also MPs. But we also sometimes use it to mean the majority of MPs in the House of Commons who support the government, so currently the Labour Party and their MPs. But here that distinction really matters because we're moving from a position where the government comes to the House of Commons and asks its MPs to vote for it to have more time that them no longer having to even ask their MPs. So there's no risk that their MPs could say, no, actually, we don't want to give you that time. Even if the risk was not that large before, they now don't have to run the risk at all. It's just their power by right, not something they have to request.
Okay, that's really clear. Thank you. So we've got the background here. Now let's go to the paper. And what's the question that you're asking about this episode in the paper?
So it's quite a simple question, really. It's, did this change in 1902, this centralisation of agenda control with the government, happen by consensus? So for these changes to come about, MPs have to vote for these procedural changes. So the question is, was this consensual? And in particular, did the opposition party, the Liberals at the time, vote for this? Or did they vote against it?
And we always build upon existing literature when we're doing this kind of research. So what did we know already, or think we knew already?
Yeah. And this paper in particular is very directly targeted at saying there's something in the literature we find a bit surprising, so let's explore that a bit more. And that something is that the existing literature tends to depict this as being a consensual procedural development. In particular, They suggest that the Unionist government brought this forward, but the Liberal
Unionist
parties...
is what the Conservative Party tended to be called in those days.
Exactly.
So Conservative might be the term that people are more familiar with.
Yeah, we can say Conservative because that's simpler, I think. The Conservative government at the time, led initially by Lord Salisbury and then by Arthur Balfour, brought forward this reform in the House of Commons, and the Liberal opposition, the main opposition party at the time, in this account, did not oppose this change. There were some other smaller parties who might have done, but the kind of big opposition party did not. And we see this being said in various bits of writing across quite a long period. And then it's sort of been most developed by a couple of political scientists called Eggers and Sperling, and a sort of relatively recent article where they also set out this idea that this was a consensual development. So that paper is not actually asking the same question as us. They're not asking, how did this reform happen? They're asking, why did this reform happen by consensus? Their kind of starting point is the thing we actually want to ask a bit about. They draw on that earlier literature, and where we come in is saying, actually, we're not that convinced that this did happen by consensus. And we think that's important because theoretically it seems a bit surprising for this to happen by consensus. It's a kind of redistributive change. It takes some power away from some MPs, and it gives more power to ministers. So we might expect MPs to dislike that if we think about their kind of self-interest. And when we look at that existing literature, there's not loads of really direct evidence. There's people saying this happened by consensus and kind of citing earlier work, but when you kind of really dig into the weeds of this, there's not loads of direct evidence based on actually how did MPs vote when this procedure came forward.
So you've got the question, how consensual was this decision? Yeah. How do you go about seeking an answer to that?
So what we do, we look at basically the voting patterns. We go back and look at the records of how MPs voted, and if the claim that we want to probe is the Liberal Party either didn't oppose this or even embraced this, we think, well, let's look at how Liberal MPs voted. And to the extent they voted against this, that would seem incompatible with the existing story.
So that sounds pretty simple. Mm-hmm. What do you find?
So we find basically that we look at one vote which is on adopting this change, the key change we single out that we think is particularly important. And we also look at 8 further votes that were on amendments trying to water down that proposal. And on all 9 of those votes, we find that the Liberal Party voted unitedly against the government proposal. So we initially tried to measure how cohesively they voted. We might think sort of a majority of Liberal MPs would vote one way and a minority another. We find none of that. They're completely united on this. Not all MPs voted, but of those MPs who vote, all of them vote against the government.
So every single one. Yeah. And I think you also find that the majority of them do actually vote. So it's not like there's only a few of them taking part in the vote.
I can't remember now if it's a majority, but one thing we do to get to the concern that might be, well, maybe they're voting against it, but they don't really care. Maybe this is only a handful of MPs turn up, and so what we're mistaking for opposition is actually, just a small number of them. But we actually show that we looked back at the previous session and looked at the kind of average turnout of Liberal MPs in their votes in that session, and we find there's higher turnout on these votes than the kind of median vote in that preceding session. So we think this is a reasonable turnout, even if it's not all MPs. And in general, turnout in these votes in this period is much lower than 100%.
So this seems very, very curious. You've got an existing literature that seems to be in agreement that this was a consensual process. Then you look at the evidence on, well, how did people actually vote in this decision? And you find that it was the complete reverse of a consensual process. Every single Liberal MP who voted against the proposal from the government. How did the existing literature manage to get it so wrong? When you talk about, well, what evidence would you look at in order to decide whether this is consensual? It seems blindingly obvious that you would look at the voting record, and the voting record shows the direct opposite of what the existing literature seems to show. So is there some more complexity in here that I'm not getting?
I think so. I'd say a couple of things, and I'd preface them both with the fact we were keen for this paper to not be a sort of pedantic gotcha, these people are wrong type paper. Rather, we wanted to sort of set out to explore again something where we think there's scope for further exploration. That might just be a semantic difference to make us feel less confrontational, but I think it's sort of important that we don't frame the paper that way. On the substance, so you've said there you think it's blindingly obvious that we should look at the votes. That's not automatically true. I do think that's true, but I think a different perspective would be to say MPs vote against, opposition MPs in particular, vote against the government for all sorts of reasons, habit, point scoring. It's just what they do. If you're the opposition, it's what's expected. And so maybe there's a difference between did they oppose it and did they vote against it. I'm sceptical of that because I think we can't really know what's inside MPs' heads. And so it seems reasonable to look at their actions and to think of opposition as being an activity rather than a mindset. It also seems more consequential to me. It's MPs' votes that will shape the outcome, not what they think when they're voting, if they're voting a different way. We also look at a few other things to try and convince ourselves more that this is sincere. So one thing people could say is, well, in 1905, 3.5 years later, the Liberals get into government and they don't change this. So that could show that actually they liked this all along and they were just, that would lend further credibility to this kind of insincerity idea. But we think that by looking at all of those amendments, and we also analyse some of the speeches that MPs give, we think it sort of bolsters our belief that this is probably sincere. That it's something we can never establish kind of really definitively. But we think if this was just token opposition, they might vote against the final thing, but also voting in favour of lots of amendments trying to water it down and giving speeches that criticise the substance rather than just attacking the government in sort of more general terms, we think makes it more credible that they might actually believe the thing they're doing. So we can interpret their voting as a fair indication of their actual opposition. So that's kind of one way in which people might reach a different conclusion from us. The other, I think, is that actually the previous people who said this happened by consensus, that wasn't really the question they were asking in their research. Quite often the types of questions we ask in political science aren't sort of factual, descriptive, what happened questions. Often they are explanatory questions about why a thing happened. And so we sort of start from someone else has said this thing happened. Let's then find out why that was and set it in some wider context. And so here, most of the citations that we find for people saying this happened by consensus, it's not their main focus. They're drawing on things that were said sort of 100 years ago in a particular book, and that seems to have just sort of sustained through, which means other people have then taken it as their starting point rather than probing it. And then the last thing I'd say is that if we step back from just the narrow question of how did MPs vote on this thing in 1902, and instead say this big change over decades of the government having more control over the agenda, was this a thing governments forced through or a thing that there was some level of broad agreement about? I think the latter is a reasonable interpretation, and so you could step back from this specific thing to say, well, there is a degree of consensus and cross-party movement here rather than only ever conflict and imposition by the government, which might then lead you to be more relaxed about sort of the precise details of who voted how in a particular year.
And what would be driving that overall change over time? Why would there be a general view that government does need to have more power over agenda setting?
So people have highlighted a number of different factors that are largely about the capacity of the House of Commons to do the sorts of things people at the time think it should do. So a couple of them are about, a couple of sort of the kinds of explanations are about rising demand for time. If Parliament has a fixed amount of time, they're clearly, if everybody wants to use it all up infinitely, then you're going to have a problem. You have a bottleneck where just things can't happen. And there's good evidence that MPs started wanting to use more time across the 19th century. Part of that might be due to changes in society and the economy that just meant there were more problems and things they wanted to highlight or legislate about. Another point is that in gradual expansion of the franchise, i.e. those with a vote over the 19th century, meant that, and this is an argument put forward by someone called Gary Cox, it meant that MPs could no longer rely on bribing a small number of people that they could easily contact to get back into Parliament at the next election. And instead they might have to think about a more kind of programmatic appeal. They might have to say, I will legislate for or support legislation for particular things to appeal to that wider audience. And so a shift of focus in their parliamentary activity towards doing things they think will help them get re-elected might become more important. And then the sort of last big part of the story is, I think, that over this period, voters are starting to see politics more in terms of political parties and to think about their choice at an election to not just be about a choice between two local candidates, well, more than two local candidates, who will have affiliations with some kind of party label, and more seeing elections as choices between parties who are rival potential governments. And so when we think about the procedural knock-on consequences of that, it might make sense that people would think that, well, once Parliament's assembled and been elected, and particularly with MPs themselves voting in a more cohesive way, mirroring that more partisan electorate, that it makes sense that the government can get on and propose things, and that it should be the role of government to take the lead and to initiate policy, rather than policy simply being the sort of amalgamation of various MPs' idiosyncratic interests.
But why then did the UK end up at a different place from
Yeah.
other democracies?
Yeah.
Do we know that?
So that is, I think, the key question, in that lots of those things explain why you would need some kind of agenda-setting process, that you basically can't have a free-for-all, you need some way of giving priority to some actors or others. Other parliamentary chambers solved that in different ways. So when we, at the start of this episode, talked about the fact that some other parliaments are more decentralised, the question of why the UK ended up going down that centralised route, I think, is a puzzling one. The one explanation that has been offered is that, in a way, they were sort of the inadvertent beneficiaries of it, that the cabinet existed and already had clearly some role in directing the conduct of government, and running an admittedly much smaller state than we have now, but running the state, and that therefore they were sort of an obvious sort of beneficiary of this process. And there wasn't necessarily some other kind of group of MPs who could advocate for no, instead let's go down some other option, let's have a more committee-based agenda-setting system, or one of the various other things. So that's one of the arguments. But I think that remains a tricky question for us to solve, because we often focus more on the push for having some agenda-setting rules and less on how did they then choose which of those rules to pick.
And does it go back to the electoral system that you mentioned right at the start, that the UK has predominantly a two-party system, apart from for a brief period of kind of transfer in the 1920s. So there are two parties that each of which like playing a majoritarian game in politics. So they like gaining majority power, holding government power, and thereby being able to kind of control things for a period. And they seem to prefer that to a model in which they might have some influence during periods when they're not in government. Whereas most other democracies in the early decades of the 20th century moved towards, at least most parliamentary democracies, moved towards a more proportional system of government in which you have coalitions of parties coming together, where you might think that there's a kind of different logic being played out in how politics work.
I think that's certainly part of it, and I think it helps to explain a sort of equilibrium between having that sort of majoritarian electoral system and majoritarian agenda-setting rules, in that once you've got yourself to the position of having these two big parties who alternate in government and have these rules, it's obviously in their interests to sustain them. There is perhaps a more complicated story actually about the causal arrow running in the other direction, in that there is an argument that first past the post doesn't automatically lead to the same two parties being the big parties everywhere, which we already see in the UK, where we have some regionally concentrated parties not being the same. So we have two-party politics in lots of places in the UK. They're not the same two parties. And so one argument that has been made is that the kind of level of nationalisation of that party system, the extent to which it actually builds to just there being these two parties, is shaped by the kind of the size of the legislative prize you're after. And so where more power is concentrated with solely the government, it increases your incentives to coalesce into a bigger team, so that when you get to Parliament, you're going to be the majority government and control those rules. Whereas if the agenda setting rules are more fragmented, more decentralised, the stakes and the incentives for that kind of coalescence are smaller, because you know you're still going to have some influence, even if you are 20% of MPs rather than that crucial 50%.
We're getting into some really juicy corners of political science. But before we go too far down that route, just a final question before we wrap up, because as ever, we're short of time. What are the implications of this for today? I mean, you kind of referred there to the idea that the UK is now in an equilibrium position where we have this majoritarian pattern of power with two parties competing for very strong power during periods of government. Does that mean that we're kind of locked into this situation where government has power over Parliament, and it's difficult to imagine us getting out of that?
I think that is a fair way of describing the situation. I don't know if it automatically follows from our research. I'm wary of drawing conclusions from something in a very different political era about the likelihood of different outcomes now. I guess what we can say is we know things have changed a bit recently. I said earlier this backbench business is a relatively recent addition, and that came about in a way through quite a sort of confusing process. There's a committee set up in the late 2000s to look at parliamentary reform in the wake of the MPs' expenses scandal. There was a sudden window which MPs exploited to come up with these proposals and then politically mobilise other MPs to back them, and this sort of exploited that moment of political opportunity to slightly lessen the government's agenda control. But even there, the MP's expenses scandal had got nothing to do with agenda control, and so sort of the parliamentary reform that emerged from that moment of crisis seemed to bear very little connection to the problem it was sort of responding to. But I think you said we're locked into this system with the two big parties. I think it's also possible to think that that isn't inevitably true. We saw at the last election the two main parties getting a very low share of the vote in historical terms. And so if we were to see coalitions in the future, that could well be something whereby a small party in a coalition might think, I stand a good chance of being back in opposition after the next election. And so maybe now would be my time to think over the long term more about the possibility that, we should spread this power out slightly more.
Okay, so you're wary of drawing conclusions from this research for that. What is the kind of takeaway message that you want our listeners to get from this research?
So I think maybe there are two. One is a sort of substantive one, more is about how we can learn interesting things about the past of parliaments. On the substantive one, I suppose it's an interesting big question, or at least I think it's interesting, to think about how do our legislative institutions evolve? Do they evolve through competition and conflict and people arguing about how they should be organised, and the team that has the most power at any one moment imposing the option that it prefers? And do they instead develop through more kind of consensual processes whereby the actors have some shared view of the problem they're trying to solve and the preferred solution to that problem? And this, at least, I think, shines a light on one important episode being a more conflictual one rather than a more consensual one. It's still compatible, of course, with other times being consensual. And then perhaps the more sort of practical point, I think, is that it's interesting to study the nitty-gritty detail of how things happened, because I think it helps us then shed more light on the bigger questions of why things happened. And that by digging into the detail of how people voted in something that could sound quite nerdy and obscure, it gets us back to that much bigger question of, how do institutions evolve, even if it starts from something very narrow. And I think often we look at the timing of reforms, or we look at how certain countries have different types of institutions, but looking in detail at how the change actually comes about, I think shines an important light on the fact that this is actually very political. It's not something that simply happens automatically.
Well, I'm certainly very much in favour of getting into nitty-gritty. And that process that you described of that kind of interaction between majority imposition type reforms and more consensual type reforms, I think that's really interesting. And often we don't, I think, just work through enough understanding what are the factors that shape what mode of institutional reform is available at any given time and how that might shift over time. So great stuff. Thank you so much, Tom. This has been really, really interesting. I've certainly learned a great deal. So hope our listeners have too. We have been discussing the article, The Origins of Centralised Agenda Control at Westminster, Consensus or Controversy, by Thomas G. Fleming, Simon Hicks and Radoslav Zubek, recently published in the journal The Legislative Studies Quarterly. There's also a blog post length version on the Constitution Unit's blog, and as ever, we will put full details of both the article and the blog post in the show notes for this episode. Next week, we're looking at the sources of growth in religion-based violence. To make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was produced by Eleanor Kingwell-Banham and Kaiser Kang. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.